Welcome to The Explainer. Between 1870 and 1900, American cities just exploded. This period basically turned the U.S. from a mostly rural country into an urban giant. But wow, this growth was messy and a lot of times pretty brutal. Today, we're digging into the tech that built these cities and the human stories behind all that staggering change.
Okay, let's dive right in. So we're going to focus on the key questions, names, and dates that really explain this period, the kind of stuff you'll definitely see on an exam.
And to kick things off, get this. In some New York City neighborhoods, the population density hit a staggering 800 people per acre. That level of crowding created just immense, unprecedented challenges for millions of people.
Okay, so we're going to break this down into 4 parts. We'll look at the explosion of growth, the new people who arrived, how everyone coped with the chaos, and finally, the new ideas that came out of it all. Let's get started.
All right, first up, let's look at why cities grew so incredibly fast and what immediate problems all that explosive growth created for the people who actually lived there. So what kicked all this off? Well, it really boils down to one key piece of tech, the steam engine. See, before steam power, factories were literally chained to rivers for energy. Steam cut those chains. It let factories pop up right in the middle of cities, creating a huge demand for labor that pulled in workers from all over. But this urban boom wasn't just about factories. It was really fueled by 4 specific innovations that completely changed what a city could even look like. Okay, first up, electric lighting. Thomas Edison's light bulb, patented in 1880, was an absolute game changer. Think about it. All of a sudden, darkness didn't mean the workday was over. Factories could run 24/7, which meant they needed even more workers for those grueling 12-hour shifts. Now, as cities got bigger, people had to find a way to get around, and that's where Frank Sprague's electric trolley comes in, invented back in 1887. It replaced the slow, horse-drawn cars and let cities spread outward, creating the very first suburbs. But cities couldn't just grow out. They had to grow up. I mean, land was getting expensive, so building up was the only way to go. New steel construction techniques, plus Alicia Otis's safe electric elevator in 1889, made the skyscraper a reality, changing city skylines forever. But all this amazing growth had a really dark side for the working class. A photographer named Jacob Riis exposed the horrible conditions of tenement life in his 1890 book, How the Other Half Lives. His photos, they were just shocking. They basically forced the rest of the country to look at the poverty in its own cities. And seeing this stuff led to some major reform movements. Some were guided by the social gospel, this idea that improving society for the poor was a Christian duty. A moment ago, we talked about the guy who exposed all this. Who was that again? Right, Jacob Riis. So here's the big thing to remember from this section. It's this paradox, right? New technology fueled this chaotic, incredible expansion, but that same expansion created these awful conditions that sparked the very first movements for urban reform. Okay, so now let's talk about the people who were actually filling up these new, crowded cities. 2 huge groups arrived, and they changed the face of urban America forever. Both groups were driven by a mix of what we call push and pull factors. African Americans were pushed out of the South by terrible racial violence and pulled north by jobs, this huge internal shift we now call the Great Migration. At the exact same time, so-called new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were being pushed out by famine and persecution and pulled in by the promise of work. Okay, now check out these numbers, because the shift is just dramatic. Before 1880, most immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe. But just look at that line for Southern and Eastern Europe. It absolutely explodes between 1890 and 1910. So, to handle this massive wave of people, the federal government opened a brand new processing center. In 1892, Ellis Island, right there in New York Harbor, became the main entry point for millions of European immigrants looking for a new start. But you know, these new immigrants, they weren't always welcomed. They were often Catholic or Jewish, spoke different languages, and that fueled a lot of resentment from groups like the American Protective Association. It led to calls for new laws to stop them from coming. This was happening at the same time as that internal movement of African Americans from the South. What was that called? The Great Migration. So you've got this amazing mix of people, but it's also fueling some serious conflict and hardship.
And that brings up a really important question. How did all these different groups, rich, poor, native-born, immigrant, actually manage the daily stress of city life?
So life in the city was chaotic for pretty much everyone. But how you dealt with that chaos? Well, that really depended on your social class. The working class, the new middle class, and the rich elite all found totally different ways to find some relief. For the working class, and especially for new immigrants, something called machine politics became this, well, it was a corrupt but really practical solution. These unofficial groups, like Tammany Hall in New York, run by Boss Tweed, would trade favors, like a job or help with the law, for guaranteed votes come election day. And yeah, let's be clear, this whole system was super corrupt. A big part of it was something called graft. That's a financial kickback a boss would get for giving a city contract to a buddy. And it meant the taxpayers ended up paying way more for everything. But it wasn't all politics. The working class also found ways to escape the daily grind through all kinds of new entertainment. For just a few cents, you could go to an amusement park, like Coney Island, catch a vaudeville show, or go cheer on your city's brand new professional baseball team. And you can really see the class divide right here. The working class had their political machines and popular entertainment. The middle class, though, just escaped the city altogether by moving to those new suburbs. And the upper class? They created their own exclusive world of museums and high culture. Speaking of those political machines, who was the boss of Tammany Hall? That was William Boss Tweed.
But there was one reform movement that pretty much everyone to get behind, the City Beautiful movement. Championed by designers like Frederick Law Olmsted, the guy who designed Central Park, it was all about making cities more livable by adding huge parks and beautiful green boulevards.
So the big takeaway here is that how you responded to the city's problems was completely shaped by your class. Each group really carved out its own way to deal with the chaos.
Okay, last section. With all this crazy change happening, how did people make sense of it all? Let's look at the new ideas thinkers and artists came up with to try and explain this new world.
Well, one idea that took hold was something called social Darwinism. People took Charles Darwin's scientific theory of evolution and kind of twisted it to apply to society. They argued that survival of the fittest explained why some people were rich and others were poor. It was a way to justify massive inequality. Meanwhile, in the world of art and books, a new movement called realism popped up. Artists and writers like Mark Twain were done with all the romantic, idealized stories. Instead, they tried to show life as it really was, gritty, tough, and complicated. A more extreme version of this was naturalism. Writers like Jack London argued that people weren't really in control at all, but were just at the mercy of huge forces like nature and genetics. But not everybody was on board with this new world. Critics like the economist Thorstein Veblen went after the new rich. He coined the term conspicuous consumption to describe how they showed off their wealth with crazy, lavish spending, which he saw as a total waste. So really, this whole period was this giant battle of ideas. People were using philosophy, art, and books to try and wrap their heads around the new industrial society they were suddenly living in.
All right, time for a rapid review. Here are the absolute must-know facts for this period. First, new tech like electricity and steel made huge factories and skyscrapers possible, which drove urbanization. Next, remember Jacob Riis. His 1890 book How the Other Half Lives exposed the terrible living conditions in the cities. Then you have the Great Migration, that huge movement of African Americans from the rural South to northern cities. Also, know that new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe faced discrimination because they were different from earlier immigrants. Machine politics was that corrupt system, like Tammany Hall, that traded city services for votes. The middle class escaped the city chaos by moving to the suburbs and focusing on education. And finally, realism. That was the artistic movement that tried to show life just as it was, hardships and all. And that's our look at the growing pains of urbanization.